Hi, my name is Jennifer Pellerin, and I'm one of the many wonderful producers on the Red Note film, La Nota Roja. It's a beautiful story of a family who loses their daughter who goes missing and how they overcome that tragedy and stay resilient as a family. And it's one of many stories that haven't been told in Ciudad Juárez, Mexico. And we're here today with Dr. Susan Tiano, who is a professor of sociology at UNM in Albuquerque. And I'm going to let Dr. Tiano share a little bit about herself and how she got to where she is today with all the knowledge and wisdom that she is sharing. Dr. Tiano, it's lovely having you.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I have been working on women's roles in economic development for more years than I care to mention. And the field work I did was in northern Mexico, in Mexicali. And I started there in the 1980s. At, at that time, the maquilas were coming in pretty rapidly. Women were taking jobs in these kinds of, in various maquila firms. And there was a huge problem happening in Juarez in that there was a high rate of maquila investment, and at the same time, women were being murdered and disappeared. They called that femicide. Um, and a lot of people blame the maquilas for this femicide, which made no sense to me, really, because Mexicali had lots of maquilas, but the femicide rate there was very low. And so it seemed to me that there was something else going on, something particular about the Juarez context that was leading to so much problems, so many problems for women. And I thought about that. I continued my research. I published a book called Patriarchy on the Line, which is still available. And when I got a chance to do it, I organized a conference on human trafficking because I had an intuition. It was probably more than an intuition. There were certain facts behind it that femicide, trafficking, and transformations in women's roles all kind of went together. But there wasn't a lot of information on it. And so I thought I would bring the leading scholars of human trafficking from as many places as I could get them to come and educate me and educate the people who were able to attend this conference. And on the basis of that, I published a book called Borderland Slavery, and I'm happy to talk about that today.
Thank you so much, Susan, for answering that. I really appreciate the lead into the questions that we have prepared for you today, and some do cite quotes from your book. So I'm looking forward to diving into that with you. Okay, the first question we have for you today, Dr. Tiano, is most people in the United States consider slavery as something that ended in the 19th century. And
Mhm.
yet you have written that today, more people are being bought and sold into slavery than at any other time in human history. Could you elaborate on that specifically as it relates to trafficking along the border?
I certainly can. Human trafficking is one of the most horrendous crimes in the global economy today. It's rising faster than we even are able to recognize. In the United States alone, there's at least 50 million people in slavery on any given day. One of the reasons it's rising so quickly and dramatically is because the kinds of things that lead it to be more common are occurring at the same time that social awareness and individual awareness of the problem is pretty minimal because it goes beneath the radar so often. When I think of the things that make it more likely, I tend to put it on a supply and demand kind of nexus, even though it's probably dehumanizing to think of people as commodities to be bought and sold. That's basically what human trafficking is. And so it's probably not an illegitimate way to think about it, to think about the factors that increase the supply of people that are vulnerable to human trafficking, as well as factors that increase the demand for their services, either in labor or sex or whatever other kinds of slavery they might find themselves. In terms of the factors that increase human trafficking, we're finding that there are major issues in the world today. What makes people more vulnerable? Part of it is global warming, which is wiping out huge communities. A large proportion of the cities in the world are on the coastlines where sea level rise is wiping out, huge tracts of those cities. It's causing an awful lot of dislocations that are ripping people out from their communities and making them available to the appeals of people who promise them a better life if they'll go somewhere else. And of course, the next thing that's making it so much worse is rising inequality within nations and between nations. The global south and north and global north are becoming more and more separate in terms of their economic well-being, or the economic well-being of the people. And that's leading to population flows, lots and lots of people, climate refugees and other vulnerable people trying to get from the global south to the global north where they might be able to have a home. So the combination of climate change and inequality is leading to all these climate refugees and other kinds of people who have no way to sustain themselves. We have wars and conflicts and violence both in the home and outside of the home that's making it harder and harder for people to manage. And this is kind of a subtle thing, but with globalization and the spread of the mass media, we have a phenomenon we sociologists think of as rising expectations. A lot of people are privy to the lifestyles of the rich and famous, and they're thinking that they should have that too, but there aren't the kinds of resources available to them to achieve that. And so they're vulnerable to the appeals of people who will give them a better life if they'll just, go somewhere else. So on the supply side, and I've just named a few causes, there's all kinds of other conditions that are going on as well. On the demand side, what we have is people who are either needing the services of a sex worker because they can't achieve them any other way, or people that are needing the work of a slave laborer because they can't find other ways to get the work that they need done. So we have essentially a funny combination of more vulnerable people and more people that want to take advantage of that vulnerability to get their needs met. And of course, what puts these supply and demand side factors together are the cartels, the organized crime networks, who are perfectly willing to step into the gap and find vulnerable people who can meet the needs of the folks who want sex workers or some other kind of labor. And usually there's an imbalance in these contexts between the availability of what we might call legitimate labor, either native-born workers or legal immigrants, to fill those jobs. And in that void, often the traffickers move people who can then fill that niche.
And one might think, and this is kind of off of our questions, but one might think that when I say one might, I say myself, that it could go even deeper than that. Like if you're going like on metaphysical levels, it could go even deeper than that. So,
Yes. I mean, ultimately,
yes.
our inability to appreciate the humanity of others
Yeah.
is probably at the root of so much of this, and social arrangements that do not allow for people to have dignity and stability and security in their lives.
Yeah. Many scholars of Mexico's maquiladora industry have noted that these factories explicitly target young women in their hiring practices. Could you talk about why the maquilas have a preference for younger female workers?
to make sense of this, actually, it helps to think about what women did before the maquilas came in. In other words, in Mexico, women had one of the lowest rates of formal labor force participation in the whole world, which didn't necessarily make sense because Mexico is a relatively developed country, and usually with development, female labor force participation increases. But in Mexico, that didn't happen. And part of that is because the government colluded with workers' unions to essentially keep women out of the labor force. And at the same time, they were able to do that because there were really strong cultural norms throughout Mexico that women's place was in the home. They weren't expected to be in formal employment. And if they did, they were being bad wives and mothers. And so both women's internal concepts of themselves and what they should be doing um, were, structured around their role as domestic workers in the household. Um, what happened though is that of course women needed to work. Many women did. They were, they needed the economic resources that could come from employment. So if they worked at all, most of them worked for a few years in their late teens and early 20s, at which point they mostly dropped out of the labor force so that they could marry and have children, or at least if they didn't want to do that, at least pretend they were, so they wouldn't get so much social discontent directed toward them. What the maquila, so when the border industrialization program was started, the government who wanted them to come in, and the boosters in Juarez who wanted them to come to provide jobs for people, they all assumed that the maquilas would come in and employ men because men were the ones that needed the jobs. The Bracero program had just ended. And this was a program of labor recruitment into the United States to replace all the men that went to war in World War II. And the Bracero program ended. All these unemployed men rushed to the border. They were sitting waiting for some kind of employment or maybe to cross back into the United States. And so the maquila program was supposed to be a way to employ these men. But instead, the factories that came into the maquilas wanted women. And they wanted women because they were cheaper, and they wanted women because they were seen as more docile and less likely to unionize, and just easier to get along with than some of these hardened male workers. And so there was this sort of mismatch between the kind of worker the maquilas wanted, and the expectations about women's ideal roles in Mexico. And the way they threaded the needle was by hiring very young women um, who would presumably work on a temporary basis in these sort of low-skilled assembly plants that didn't require much training or skill. And then they would presumably leave the labor force and go get married and have kids. And so youth ended up being sort of the sine qua non for maquila employment. Um, and as the maquilas expanded, especially with NAFTA, there weren't enough, young single women to take these jobs. They did start hiring more older women. But the ideal worker, the stereotype of the ideal worker continued to be young, and not just young, but single, childless, and women who were able to devote themselves to their jobs. The other piece of this is that a lot of households in Juarez in the times had unemployed males, even though the expectation was that the household was supposed to be supported by a male breadwinner. The person who supported the household ended up being the working daughter who was able to get a job in a maquila. And of course, this led to some interesting dynamics, but really it changed the notion of women's roles such that there was a conservative backlash from the men who really wanted the jobs instead, from the fathers who felt they couldn't control their daughters anymore, from the husbands or the older brothers, in other words, there was a male patriarchal backlash. And I think that had a lot to do with some of the femicide that we saw in Juarez later on. But that's probably getting ahead of myself a little bit.
That is incredible. Okay, are you ready for number three?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the next question in line, Dr. Tiano. In Borderland Slavery, you wrote that many human trafficking victims begin their journeys voluntarily, only to become enslaved, exploited, and exchanged. In many cases, they are lured into becoming victims by the offer of a legitimate job on the other side of the border. Can you take us through the process, step by step, of how trafficking victims unknowingly allow themselves to become enslaved in what you call the human trade?
Yeah, I'll try. There are so many ways that traffickers get their hands on women and men as well. Because we have both sex trafficking, which usually involves women, and labor trafficking, which typically involves men, although it can be women as well. I mean, one of the obvious ways is to just capture them. You know, they're walking down the street, a car pulls up, grabs them, takes away with it, and takes off with them. And this happens fairly often, especially in contexts where the police and other social control agents are on the take or paid to turn a blind eye to this sort of behavior. But it's much easier for traffickers if they can get the victims to go voluntarily. And they do that usually through manipulation, the promises of a wonderful job somewhere else. Um, or you might, or they might manipulate, they might use someone that they're linked to manipulate the woman into crossing the border under other auspices. So, for example, in borderline slavery, we have an example where a woman, wasn't a maquila worker, she was just a non-working woman in Juarez, met a guy at a disco, fell madly in love with him. He nurtured that relationship for a while and then convinced her that they really needed to cross the border for a hot weekend. And she went with him voluntarily. And as soon as she crossed, they took away her papers and sold her into trafficking because he was part of the trafficking network. And of course, this woman was rescued. We wouldn't have even known about her probably in her story if it hadn't happened that way and if she hadn't been rescued. But the legions of women who are duped in this way and never found, we really don't know about. The numbers are probably pretty high. Another way they do it is by finding someone. This often happens in rural communities. They'll find someone who's from that community. They'll enlist her support. They'll get her to go to the community, rave about all the fabulous jobs that they could get if they, did whatever it is she wants them to do. And they do that, and then bam, they're trafficked. Their passports or papers are stolen, and they're stuck. Sometimes they do it. In fact, probably the most common way these days is through advertisements in newspapers and other kinds of places where people can find out about help wanted. And they will tell them there's great jobs, and all they have to do is, sign up. And then they transport them, sometimes over the border, sometimes not, and take their papers and documents and money, and boom, they're trafficked. Um, so essentially, those are some of the dynamics. The common denominator is often wanting a job, feeling like they can't get a good job where they are, being enlisted by a trafficker with promises of great jobs someplace else, and then being indentured or captured. And oftentimes the traffickers will force the person to pay back the huge expense of whatever it costs to transfer them. And that keeps them in bondage forever because they can never come up with enough money to buy their freedom. And so they're sort of like long-term indentured servants that can't get out of their bondage. So these are some of the ways that it happens.
Thank you for sharing that. The next question that I would have for you, Dr. Tiano, would be Richard Schaefer and Carolyn Gonzalez write that the cell phone is the most dangerous item in trafficking victims' possession, as it would typically have the numbers of relatives, which would make them prime targets for kidnapping and ransom. Can you talk about how traffickers might use the information on cell phone to target victims' families after their child has been trafficked?
This is really a scary one. Um, Most everybody has cell phones, and they list all their friends and relatives in their contact file with numbers. Um, and because human trafficking can often blend into hostage taking, um, the traffickers need a way to get a hold of the relatives and the loved ones of the trafficked victim so that they can demand a ransom, so that they can hold this person in bondage until the ransom comes. And of course, while they're in bondage, they may use them for other things, like force them to carry drugs across the border, or put them in sex, you treat them as sex slaves, or forced laborers, or whatever. Or sometimes they'll just sort of sit around waiting for the payment to be made. But the way the trafficker gets a hold of the person's relatives is through the contacts on the cell phones. And so, and of course, the traffickers then call the relative, and if you don't pay the money, then we will not release the person. And so the relatives become victimized just as much, almost, as their loved one does. And so, really, the message, and Richard and Carolyn found this out too from the people they interviewed, that the message has gone through the networks of would-be immigrants: either don't carry a cell phone at all, or delete your contacts, or carry some kind of temporary one that you can use, because they're so dangerous for. And in fact, that even having a cell phone might in fact cause the traffickers to hold them as hostage when they weren't going to in the first place.
Thank you for sharing that as well, Dr. Tiano. I appreciate that. All right. Um, Dr. Tiano, we're at question number 5. During our research, we have read about stories where female workers in the maquiladoras of Ciudad Juárez were forced to undergo menstrual examinations after being hired so that their employers can make sure they aren't pregnant, and then are forced to take birth control to prevent them from becoming pregnant. Have you ever encountered stories such as these in your research? And if so, can you elaborate on them?
Yes, I certainly have. As I said earlier, they want young women, but they also want single childless women. And the thinking is that if a woman has kids, she is going to be torn between her responsibilities to her job and to her children. So they'd much prefer to have a childless woman in, in comparison to a married mom. The other thing, of course, about having children is that at least at least within the context of Mexican labor laws, where employers are supposed to uh, pay for maternity costs, and even provide childcare in some contexts, they much prefer women for those reasons as well. So they often give them pregnancy tests when as part of the application process, and they certainly won't hire them if they're pregnant. And then they periodically administer them as time goes on, to make sure they haven't become pregnant in the job, and would therefore end up costing them, maternity kinds of benefits. And so I did see a lot of that. They'd hand out birth control pills on the job, they'd give them prescriptions, etc., to make sure that they had access to birth control. But the other thing I saw, and this was more subtle, one of the things they did was demean women for having children. I was once working in a factory, or well, interviewing a woman who worked in a factory in Mexicali, and her supervisor walked up and said, I can't remember the woman's name now, but she's a hot mama. She already has 2 illegitimate children, and if she has another, she's going to lose her job. And she said that right in front of that woman, who just blushed and felt horrible. And it was clear from that, and other things that I encountered in my research, that one of the ways of keeping them childless was to harangue women who had children and make them feel bad about themselves. And that would help prevent women from getting in the same situation. And women who had children often told me that they felt like there was an axe hanging over them. They needed their wages to support those children, but they were punished for having them in the first place. And so motherhood was always kind of a dilemma for women, and they were better off if they were just able to be single for those few years they worked there and then leave the job once they had their kids.
Thank you. Okay, moving along. The next question that I would have for you would be the femicide in Ciudad Juárez began around 1993, the same time that the city's maquiladora industry was undergoing rapid expansion after NAFTA. Can you talk about how the expansion of the maquiladora industry in Juarez and the spread of free trade policies in Mexico created a perfect storm that not only facilitated the spread of human and sex trafficking along the border, but contributed to the femicide in Juarez?
I mean, I kind of alluded to this early on that the links between femicide, maquilas, the expansion of free trade in the borderlands is a complicated one. And the place that I would start in trying to explain this is to say that femicide existed long before NAFTA. Juarez has had, one of the highest rates of female abuse and homicide in the world, and it has for decades. I mean, I grew up in Albuquerque, well, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the 50s, and we knew of Juarez as a dangerous place for women even then. We might not have called it femicide, but it was kind of a scary place to go. Um, the way that I think about it is thinking about Mexico and what happened to Mexico in the 80s, because that's really when the femicide problem in Juarez started growing out of proportion. And what happened in the 80s is that Mexico faced what we called a debt crisis. It had borrowed so much money from international lenders throughout the 70s and the 60s and the 70s, and with flexible rates of interest. So that as interest rates rose during the 70s, a lot of governments couldn't pay them back, including Mexico. So in 1982, Mexico faced a horrible debt crisis in that it owed all this money to foreign lenders and it didn't have the capital or resources to pay it back. And so the international community worried that if Mexico defaulted on its debts, other countries would follow. What would happen to the international banking system? So what they did was they leaned on Mexico, essentially, and basically forced them to restructure their economy. And it's way too complicated to explain all this, and it would probably bore you anyway. But essentially, Mexico in those days had really rigid requirements about foreign investment. A foreigner could not come in and buy a house or buy a company or whatever unless they only owned 40% of it. And they had protective tariffs that helped protect the economy from foreign investment. And so Mexico developed and flourished under a system in which farmers and businessmen didn't have to compete with foreign products because they were hidden by what we call tariff barriers. What the international community did in the 80s was try to force Mexico to transit from a more state-run economy with state planning and state ownership of a lot of the resources to more of a free market economy where any international investor could come in if they had the capital, and Mexico would have to allow that. And so what we saw during the 80s was a transformation to more of a free market economy in Mexico. In the early days of the maquilas, there was just a small free trade zone along the borders where foreign investment could go. And what happened during the restructuring of the 80s is the whole country was essentially turned into a free trade zone, so that international capital could come in, they could buy pretty much whatever they wanted, and the state could not keep them from exploiting workers or continue to supplement the wallets of workers by giving them housing and health care and other kinds of social supports. There was also a tendency to keep prices down by, manipulating them. And the state had all kinds of ways to make it easier for people to live and easier for businesses to flourish. And all of this had to change in the 80s as the country was restructured. So we had currency valuation and inflation, and the peso bought less, and people lost their jobs, and it was just a horrendous time all throughout the 80s. And frankly, it wasn't just Mexico that this happened. It happened in Central America and a lot of other places in Latin America as well. So by the time that NAFTA was negotiated in 93, Mexico was pretty much on its knees already. It didn't have the leverage to enter the NAFTA negotiations on a basis on par with Canada and the United States. And so they ended up kind of on the losing end of the NAFTA proposition. And the rural sector, the corn and bean producers who were used to actually government subsidies and favoritism, they now had to compete with American corn and American beans, and they lost their livelihoods. And the same thing happened to ranchers in the cattle sector. Anyway, there were all these rural people who had lost their livelihoods, and they were coming to the border because really the only place that was booming under NAFTA was the U.S. Mexico borderlands, where all these industries were leaving from the United States to set up shop to take advantage of the cheap labor in Mexico. So there were jobs in the maquilas, and there was a lot of immigration from the south to the north, but a lot of dislocations, a lot of community breakdown, and the kinds of things that can lead to femicide. And so what we have then is tremendous immigration, people waiting to cross over, a lot of vulnerability, and all of that combined to destabilize the economic structures in Juarez and other border towns, and make people ripe for human trafficking. And of course, meanwhile, the cartels surged in this kind of economic transition. The black market is a place where people can find jobs and where there are profits to be made. And so at the same time that people were becoming more vulnerable, the black market was thriving, and the cartels were emerging. They'd been, trafficking drugs across the border and had the networks all lined up. The pattern was, it's well known, the cartels would supply drugs to American consumers, and the Americans would supply guns to Mexico, to the cartels. And so, those trade networks were well established, and it wasn't a far stretch for them to take advantage of vulnerable people to force them into trafficking. So both femicide, trafficking, all of that went hand in hand with the economic dislocations that happened from the 80s on and were accelerated with NAFTA.
In Borderland Slavery, you write that increased immigration enforcement along the border promotes migrants' reliance on coyotes, and in so doing increases their vulnerability to trafficking networks such as Los Zetas or El Golfo. Tony Payan also writes that without a binational approach that considers how each country's immigration policies impact the others, human trafficking across the Mexico-US border is not likely to stop. Can you talk about how US drug and immigration policies have contributed to the problem of trafficking and gender violence along the border, and the need for cooperation between the United States and Mexico to address these issues?
I'm happy. There's a paradox here because most people believe that if we just crack down on immigration, we'll fix human trafficking. And the paradox is actually that makes it worse. And to understand why, we have to think about what went on, or what's been going on really since the 80s and 90s in the world economy under globalization. What globalization did was, in essence, make it easier for goods and products and people to flow across the international system for a number of different reasons that I won't go into now. And what happened consequently is that through the industrial restructuring we talked about, countries like Mexico were forced to open their doors to the flow of goods and services. And so they couldn't have protective barriers around their economy anymore. So goods and services flowed more freely, not just into countries in the global south, but throughout the world economy. And people started flowing accordingly too, but because of fears among the government or the people that all these newcomers might upset the apple cart. I mean, there's always been a fear of immigrants throughout the United States and in so many other places. They would tighten up immigration law so that at the same time goods and services were flowing across the border, people couldn't. And this led to really difficult contradictions because people needed jobs in the United States, or at least they thought they needed jobs in the United States more and more, and yet they couldn't get in legally because quotas were filled or whatever immigration policies were being used were tightening up the number of people that could be admitted. So what you end up in is a situation where people want to come in and they can't come in legally, and so they turn to illegal means to try to get them across. And in the Southwest we call them coyotes or polleros. These are black market agents, these are the smugglers that are often linked to the black market agents who are in fact traffickers. So what happens essentially is that you pay the coyote to get you across, and sometimes you make it across and he says goodbye. But other times you pay the coyote to get you across, and he then takes your passport and your papers and your money and your cell phone and hands you over to the traffickers. Or he was a trafficker all along, or he worked for the traffickers, or he's networked with the traffickers or whatever. And so there's all these cases of dead migrants being found in places like Tamaulipas, and or on the other side of the border as well. And these are usually people who were duped by the coyotes into crossing or trying to cross, and then for whatever reason the trafficking situation went awry and the person ended up in bad circumstances or dead or whatever. But so I think the point I really want to make is that when we tighten up channels for channels for legal immigration, that opens the door to people who want to participate in illegal immigration, namely the traffickers, to take advantage of vulnerable people who are going to cross one way or the other. And of course, Tony Payan, my colleague, he understands this phenomenon pretty well. And his thinking is, if we don't adjust U.S. immigration policies to try to harmonize them with the kinds of needs of people in Mexico and really Central America, Latin America, and wherever else they might be, if we don't harmonize our legislation a little bit more carefully, we're going to end up with these kinds of contradictions.
Can you talk about the role that corrupt guardians, such as the police, immigration officers, or political officials, and the illicit drug money that facilitates this corruption play in perpetuating human and sexual trafficking along the border?
Yeah, it's pretty clear to me, and I think most experts would agree with this, that human trafficking wouldn't work as well as it did if the traffickers didn't have compatriots among the so-called social control agents, the formal officials that are supposed to regulate transfers of goods and people across the border. Sometimes these officials are absolutely corrupt. They've been, paid off by drug traffickers, or there's money to be made, and they in fact make it. The word mordida is common in Mexico, that people are paid off, but with little bits of money. Sometimes officials are just, they're not really on the take, they're not corrupt, they're just so they're in such complicated jobs with so many demanding expectations that they can't pay attention to everything. And so drug and human smuggling kind of can slip by without even, they don't even have time to think about it. But I think a third problem is selective perception. When we think trafficking is something else, when we think that a traffic victim is really an illegal immigrant in disguise, and who wants illegal immigrants because they're bad, or, and I use the word illegal in quotes, I hate to use that expression. Um, or if we think that there's really no such thing as human trafficking, it's really prostitution in disguise. And we don't like sex workers, so we won't notice if women are in bondage. A lot of these sort of preconceptions that are based on stereotypes about sex work or immigration. When officials are locked into those kinds of worldviews, they often don't notice the kinds of trafficking that's going on right under their noses. And so for all these reasons, I think there's a lot of collusion, either advertently or inadvertently, between the officials that are supposed to regulate exchanges of goods and people across the border and the traffickers.
Scholars have noted the financial motivations behind trafficking for Mexico's organized crime groups, in that narcotics such as heroin or cocaine require high overhead to produce a product that can be sold only once, whereas trafficking, victims can be exploited over a period of several years with relatively low overhead costs. Can you talk about how sexual and human trafficking represents an effort by these organized crime groups to diversify their asset portfolio?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Human trafficking is tremendously profitable. It generates an estimated $236 billion each year. And I saw one statistic that said that in the last decade, the profits have increased by 37%. I'm not sure how they necessarily measure that, but I mean it's huge, and it's a growingly profitable activity. Um, and of course, a lot of the same cartels that uh, uh, traffic humans have long histories of trafficking drugs across the border, and guns and animals and all kinds of other things that aren't supposed to be crossing the border. Um, and of course, drugs can be consumed only once, but trafficking, as long as the person stays alive and is able to continue to do the work, um, an estimated $10,000 a year is made per trafficked person by the cartels that traffic them. So and of course, at the same time, because of all the stereotypical thinking about what human trafficking is, it tends to go beneath the radar of a lot of people. So it's hard to detect it, and a lot of the cartels don't get busted for it, basically. So you end up in a situation where the benefits are tremendous and the costs are relatively minimal, and therefore it's kind of irrational not to do it, at least if all you care about is money. And so what we end up, I think, is a situation where traffickers have added humans to their list of trafficked commodities, along with drugs and guns and whatever else they need to be trafficking.
For our last question, Dr. Tiano, you and Moira Murphy-Aguilar wrote that in the long run, the ideal scenario would be to eliminate human trade by transforming the conditions that allow it to flourish. Such a worthy objective is unlikely to be achieved anytime soon. However, because the dynamics that give rise to forced physical and sexual labor are so deeply embedded in the global economy that uprooting them will require fairly drastic social changes. Can you discuss the challenge or even the impossibility of combating trafficking in the face of these deeply embedded dynamics?
This is such a profound question, and I've thought about it a lot, actually. And ideally, sociologists want to attack problems by eliminating their causes, but the odds of us eliminating global warming, oh my goodness, um, or social inequality, patriarchy, wars, conflict, violence. I mean, these things, at least the way the world economy is structured right now, look like they're with us to stay. And so, therefore, I think that the best shot we have is to try to increase awareness of what's going on so that citizens of our country, at least I'll talk about it from the point of view of the United States anyway, that citizens of our country can come up with better kinds of strategies for electing good people who are going to be able to do something about some of the problems, and um, making sure that they and their loved ones are not duped by traffickers. So, to the extent that we understand what trafficking is and how the traffickers work and what makes us vulnerable to them, then we can do something about at least keeping people from making, I don't want to say bad choices, but making the kind of choices that end up making them vulnerable to human traffickers. Um, that's one of the reasons why I had the conference that I had, the reason I put out this book. I really wanted it to be available not just to potential traffic victims and their families, but also lawmakers and politicians who are able to do policies that could at least ameliorate the problem to some extent. So, the nonprofit sector is stepping up to the plate. There's lots of organizations now that are dealing with human trafficking in some way or another, trying to raise money to help victims out or to raise awareness or whatever. And so the nonprofit sector, I think, is doing a great job. And I think people like you who are, creating films so that people will be more aware of the possibility of trafficking, that's, I think, an important step in the right direction. If for me, actually, I think the most important thing we could do right now is immigration reform. We have to, as much as we can, allow legal immigration and not try to put a stop to it. It may be that a lot of people in the United States anywhere feel nervous about folks who speak different languages or look a little different from them. But really, this is the human condition. This is what we come in for, to try to understand how to appreciate diversity and difference, and how to understand what incredible contributions immigrants can make to our society. Right now, we've got an aging society with lots of retired people and not enough high enough birth rates for people to come into the workforce to support them, essentially. Immigration is the only way that we're going to be able to get around this dilemma, because the rates of natural increase in our population are not going to continue to rise, because a lot of women don't want to have children because of global warming and all the factors that I've talked about before. Some might say it's irrational to have children in a context like this. I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that it's irrational to stop immigration, because that's the mechanism through which we empower our population, through young people who are able to work, and young mothers who are able to have children to increase our population growth. So, immigration reform is vital. And I worry that with current policies, we're going in a different direction. And so, I would recommend to us to really look at that and think about it. Immigrants are often the best and the brightest. It's a drain from the country that loses them, but it's a net asset for the country that gains them. So I think immigration reform would be probably this, other than increasing awareness of trafficking, it's the single most important thing we can do to try to solve the problem, or at least alleviate it to some extent. On a more humanistic or spiritual level, I think we really need to think about people in different places as being pretty much the same as us. They might look a little bit different. They might speak somewhat differently, but they're basically humans just as we are. And if we could, I think, expand our awareness to try to understand the humanity of all of us, I think that human trafficking, which is, I think, probably the worst of the dehumanizing tendencies that we have going on in our society, would be able to be addressed and ameliorated. And frankly, I think that's what we are here for. And I hope that more and more of us will try to take some responsibility for embracing diversity and embracing the differences among us, because that's what makes us strong and that's what makes us human.
Dr. Tiano, you're my people. I couldn't have said it better myself. That was so beautifully stated. So beautifully stated. And I just want to thank you for taking the time to share your insights with us today. Your expertise and perspective have been incredibly valuable. And I know our audience will gain so much from your knowledge. On behalf of our entire Red Note team, we truly appreciate you being here and contributing to this conversation.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.